Good afternoon. We are going to really be speaking to with a panel around just effective online teaching and learning, specifically of diverse learners. So my name is Faith Shanholtzer, and I'm currently the Vice President of our Curriculum Instruction and Strategic Programming here at K12. And also with us, we have Jeanna Pignatiello. She is our Chief Academic Officer of our Teaching and Learning Office. And then we also have Niyoka McCoy, and she is our Vice President of Talent and Development and Community. And so we are really excited to be here today to really speak to you all about online learning, most importantly, how that can be effective. And so I wanted to just share, before I kick it over to Jeanna to share just a little bit of information about us. Certainly this pandemic has really changed the educational landscape, I think, forever. I don't think we'll ever view education in the same way based on the experience over the last year. And so many school districts have had to quickly, in sort of emergency mode, transition to a more digital, remote environment. And while there is a lot of, I would say, opinion and debate about how to go about doing that and what's really considered effective and what's working, and how it's potentially created some frustration and created some gaps potentially around thinking around, SEL and thinking about the needs of our students and what they're experiencing, but also from an academic perspective and perhaps, creating some gaps there. That being said, online instruction certainly can be effective when it is really thoughtfully planned out and using sort of the technology, the tools, and the resources in a very strategic way. And so when we think about, how we go about doing that, let me just share here. We want to make sure that we're talking about culture and setting that up in that type of environment, and how we focus on assessment and personalizing and customizing the learning for our students, as well as how we're professionally training and providing opportunities for our teachers and support staff. And so it really will be our focus today. But I wanted to turn it over to Jeanna to share some information around K12, and she'll share here, actually formerly known as K12, we are now sort of rebranded and we are now Stride. But I wanted her to share some information about us as a company, and thinking about the diversity that we have within our company and how we're supporting across the company in terms of blended options for our students. And so I want to let Jeanna share a little bit about our company, and then we will go right into our panel discussion.
Great, thank you, Faith. I appreciate it, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed these last couple of days. I know I have, and have captured a lot of follow-up notes and actions and ideas and innovative thoughts and ways to look forward as we transform what is the education landscape. And I thought it would be important to ground all of the participants here today of kind of who we are and what brought the three of us here today, and the organization that we are a part of that has been focused on online learning for 20 years. So for many, this past spring brought about something that school districts had never even thought about. They hadn't really built an infrastructure in online learning. For many people, even if I've been with the organization for 14 years, people still go, wait, what's online learning? What does that mean for a kindergartner? What does that mean for a fifth grader? But we've been at this for 20 years, and you'll forgive the three of us today. As you heard Faith mentioned, we have for 20 years been under the K12 brand, and this month marks kind of a new evolution for our organization as we shift to a new umbrella brand of Stride. And just really quickly, what does that mean is, we're going to use K12 and Stride interchangeably today, so forgive us, but we really started 20 years ago in that K-12 general education space, and looking at how can we bring online education and blended options to students across the country, this new way of learning. And we embarked on this 20 years ago, and we have since expanded into career and technical education, career and college readiness preparation. But we also have started to expand into really the lifelong learner path and the education of not just kindergarten through 12th grade, but how do we get into that post-secondary support? And our partnerships and other parts of our organization, such as Galvanize and Tech Elevator and Med certifications, where we look at not just supporting students again in that K-12 education space, but how do we prepare them for the workforce and college and career readiness and beyond. But for the purpose of today, I know we're really going to be rooted in conversations around the K-12 education space. And so right now, we currently have relationships with both charter and district programs across the country. We are in 30 states and the DC area. And we have served over 2 million students over the course of our 20 years in online learning. We currently have almost 200,000 students enrolled in our full-time online programs, roughly around 195,000. We have over 100 full-time programs. 75 of them or so are in the K-12 general education space, elementary, middle, and high school online programs. 32 programs focused on career learning. Again, we have a balance of partnerships of working with both charter networks and district partners as well. And when we think about our student population, we roughly have 47% of our students eligible for free and reduced lunch. And we have an average special education population in the area of 16%. Now, I will tell you, in some of our states and our schools within those states, they are seeing special education populations well over 20% in their programs as well. So it certainly varies, but we are certainly on the higher side of the average special education population. And we really think about, as you look, thinking about education as a service. So not just in the support we have of these schools, part of our organization is we have focused for 20 years on the online course development. We have over 980 online courses that equates to over 100,000 lessons and 1 million multimedia components within that curriculum. We have a network of over 6,000 educators, many of these educators who have been teaching online in this environment for 5, 10, 15 years. And so they bring in expertise to what it means to deliver online education. Again, we partner with over 1,000 school districts. So on the slide before, we're talking about our full-time school charter and public school options, but we also partner with over 1,000 school districts across the country and providing them what we call our learning solution options. And so maybe they partner with us for a teacher workforce or in our online curriculum. We're very focused on career pathways and certificates, working with our high school students to get those certificates, industry certificates during high school so they're prepared for the post-secondary, getting them dual credit and early college credit. We focus a lot on the project-based learning to increase that engagement and that real-world application across our offerings, and branching out as well into work-based learning. So getting our students ready to not just be ready for the workforce here in the United States, but in a global economy. So that's just a little bit about us, and we thought it was important to start and you guys be rooted a little bit on where our experience is coming from. But I'm going to turn it over to Faith now, because we really want to spend the bulk of the time talking to all of you about the ways in which we have focused on serving diverse learners, what we have seen that's gone really well during this pandemic, and what has gone not so well that hopefully you can take away and learn from with the institutions that you work with. And I'll add one more before I turn it over to Faith. The Q&A is open, so as you have questions for us, please feel free to leverage the question and answer option there, and we will either pivot right during the panel, or we will certainly get to those questions as we get to the conclusion of our time together. So with that, Faith, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, Faith, we don't have your audio.
Go. Thank you, Jeanna. We appreciate the overview. And as you can see, we have a little bit of experience with working with a diverse population of not only students, but certainly thinking about adults as well. So, as I opened up and mentioned, as this pandemic has forced folks to think about and rethinking about education and how we deliver instruction, there certainly is a lot of conversation, debate, and opinions around serving students and serving diverse learners in this environment. And so, Jeanna, I just want to ask you, there's been, obviously, as I mentioned, a lot of headlines discussing the inability of schools to serve diverse learners. So thinking about our students with disabilities, our EL learners, our students that come from a low economic household. Do you feel like those headlines are accurate, and are we failing to meet the needs of diverse learners?
Thanks for that question, Faith. And, as an educator, it does break my heart a little bit to say, unfortunately, in too many instances, we are failing to meet the needs of our diverse learners across the country. I'm not saying that's everywhere. We certainly have pockets where they have done an exceptional job and we can learn from that. But there are a lot of instances during this pandemic where those headlines are accurate. And we haven't seen the focus on adequately meeting the needs of diverse learners in our online environment. And I think there was this initial during when the pandemic hit, and I will say during the spring of last year, we were in what we would call crisis and temporary remote learning. What we saw last spring was not online learning. It was not hybrid learning. It was crisis, get the Band-Aids and duct tape out and figure out what we can do with this pandemic that no one could have, foreseen to the magnitude it became. And what unfortunately we saw in some instances, though, is that there was just too much belief, I think, in too many education institutions that the summer would come, this would fade away, and they wouldn't really need to plan for the fall, for true online and hybrid learning in the fall. And too many, again, assumed we would just go back to normal. August would come and we would be back to that, quote, normal in the traditional ways we've educated students. I reflect when I think about that, and my sister is a third grade teacher in Indiana, and I talked to her all summer and she kept saying, I haven't heard anything. I don't know when I'm going back. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what platform we're going to be using. I don't know what programs I'm going to be using to begin planning to meet the diverse needs of the students that were going to be in her third grade classroom. And it wasn't until 2 weeks prior to the first day of school that she received any guidance as to what that first week of school would look like. And she found out, blindsided, that they were opting for online learning through at least October. And so here she was in this small 2-week window of trying to figure out the basics of doing a general education approach. And so getting to how to meet the needs of the diverse learners and the skills she would need and how to support second language learners, students with disabilities, any of that in her classroom, there was little to no preparation. But then we do know there were those that were successful. And the thing that we're seeing is the difference is they took a very different proactive approach. They focused first and foremost on actually establishing a culture and a system for online and blended learning. They took the time to think about the culture and really the mindset. And this is where that growth mindset and grit, that mindset that all students would succeed no matter what type of environment they had to deploy in August, whether it was fully online, it was hybrid, it was blended, it was a mix of that. Those that were successful went in with some very intentional planning, and they thought about the culture and the mindset they needed to establish. And we all know as school leaders, like that culture is going to be created with or without you, right? So either you take the reins and establish that, or someone else will, and will create those learning environments. And there's a quote from a School Culture Rewired article from years ago that I use often, and it's, the culture of any organization is shaped by the worst behavior the leader is willing to tolerate. And I think during that window, we saw, a portion of our leaders tolerate maybe too much of that poor behavior. We saw teachers and leaders that didn't have the basic belief that students could and would succeed in this online environment, and a lot of excuses and why that wouldn't work. But again, in those pockets where it did, it was a stark contrast of that belief that every student would learn in an online environment, and they established that culture. They focused on a vision and a system. And they looked at where they were in the spring, recognized that was not where they wanted to be in the fall, and they took all the steps needed to prepare and build that system in the fall for those leaders. And they built a system, and those that were successful again in meeting the diverse learner needs is they looked at what students needed, what teachers needed, what parents needed, the support staff, the community resources. They approached it holistically. So there was no broad brush painted that would just apply to everyone. They thought about each of those stakeholders and the diverse needs of those stakeholders. And I'll leave you with, there were really two key questions that leaders that built an infrastructure to support a diverse population and diverse learners' needs is they spent the summers looking at, how do I as a school leader ensure equitable online learning opportunities for all students, teachers, and families? And the second piece was, what are the barriers I need to remove? And they spent those summer months removing those barriers and coming up with the solutions to make sure there wasn't anything that impeded learning for those students.
Great, thank you, Jeanna. So from what I'm hearing you say is that it certainly is possible to meet the needs of diverse learners in this online environment. And so you mentioned, in part, it's that intentional planning, right? And establishing the culture up front as part of that planning. And so, thinking about the planning piece, so how do we actually go about sort of implementing that plan, right? So the plan's only as good as we can implement, right? And so does that, entail more accountability? Is there more accountability needed to ensure that the needs of our learners are being met across the board?
Yeah. I mean, yes, and yes. There has to be accountability, and accountability in the good sense, not the negative connotation that accountability, tends to take on. And it first starts with just coming over this myth that we can't meet the needs of diverse learners, right? When this pandemic hit, you just heard right away people saying, you can't support students with disabilities in an online environment. You can't address that. And, the reality is, yes, we can. And first and foremost, I think we failed to give our students credit. They're digital natives. They know this space. They learn in this space. They interact with their peers in this space. In many cases, the adults, we were the ones that were a little bit behind in thinking of the innovative ways that we can do this. And, I'll share with you, there was a report this week from the US Government Accountability Office. And they talked, it was clear, educators were struggling with how to meet the wide range of needs with students with disabilities and students who struggled academically, students that had emotional and behavioral support needs, or they were medically fragile. And what came through with that is that those teachers were hungry. They were hungry for training. They were hungry for resources and for support. And many of those teachers too that we talked about during this planning, I kept hearing this thing, well, teachers are on contract. We don't have them in the summer. We can't have them do this. Most teachers, myself included, when I was a teacher, I was in my classroom during the summer. It didn't matter if I wasn't under contract. I was prepping and preparing. And these teachers, what we heard was they were willing to put in that work to learn the tricks of the trade. And so part of that planning in places where they were successful is they leveraged that. They pulled those teachers in to support with that planning. They pulled in experts across the field. I know at K12, we partnered with many districts to come in and give our resources and our training and what it meant, to share how we provide things like related services in an online environment. They leveraged those resources out there to equip their staff. One of the things that was really disappointing in this schedule, and I hope that those that are here with us today or listening at a later time will take if they're a school leader, was this study talked about how schools adjusted students' learning goals in service plans as a solution. I find that discovery infuriating as an educator, to say that instead of figuring out innovative ways and alternate ways to deliver services to ensure students could meet goals, they modified the goals and they modified the service plans. And I think we really have to shift our mindset, and those that were intentional in their planning, as you've asked, and they figured out a way, again, not to lower the bar, change the goals, take away services. They sat down and were intentional in figuring out, how do I deliver them in a new way, in an innovative way? One of the things too that was really frustrating was states then just said, well, prioritize in-person learning with students with disabilities or with English language learners. Then just have that be the population that comes into the building. But that's not acceptable. If they wanted that option, great, support that and offer it. But to make that the only option is not the type of planning that helps meet the diverse needs of those students. And what that risk was, you took was the safety and health of some of our most vulnerable populations, and you brought them back into the building. We know that English language learners, and there wasn't a good bridge in many places to bring in those homes where English wasn't the primary language spoken. But those that were really successful were intentional in the planning of how do we translate communication? How do we bring curriculum that we can serve up in multiple languages to the students? How do we equip, an interesting statistic is those that provide support for English language learners tend to be the ones with the least professional development. And I know Niyoka is our expert and that will talk about that, but it goes back to those teachers were hungry for that support. And the truth is there's so many resources out there. And I think the districts that were successful in that planning is they looked at ways you can do speech therapy virtual. There are many programs out there that allow you to do it. There are therapies that can be delivered virtually, counseling and social emotional learning programs that are designed to be delivered in an online virtual environment. And there's also service providers, we've worked with them for 20 years, that will go out and do one-to-one physical therapy in a safe place, taking all the COVID precautions, but that you could still bring those services. But the final thing I will say that really was kind of the difference here in the planning and making this successful is focusing on compliance rather than engagement. And too often the program design, especially when we're meeting the needs of diverse learners, as we went, here's the checklist of what students need to do, when you have to log in, when you have to be available, how you have to turn in an assignment. And we were focused really heavily on compliance rather than the engagement or the barriers that might be in the way of that student's learning. So instead of focusing on this has to be done at 9 o'clock and I'm only delivering the assessment in this fashion and turned in this way, those that were successful focused on those ways to do it differently and took away that compliance. They weren't the compliance police. They put that aside and they focused on different ways to engage learners. And so if you don't mind, Faith, I'd like to actually flip it back to you and ask you a question, because with your focus on curriculum assessment and instruction and that personalized learning, I'm talking a lot about kind of higher level of what they did in terms of culture and planning. But then there comes down to the day-to-day. The importance of assessing and understanding where students are, especially your diverse learners, because we know progress monitoring with our diverse learners as frequently as possible can help us redirect our instruction. So knowing that importance of assessment that it provides and that information that helps us drive student intervention and achievement, can you talk to us about how this can be done effectively in an online environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I, part of what I'm going to say is much in what you're saying around this, initial planning and the importance of the planning of this. And I think we've heard and we saw a lot of reports in that, they just kind of put a halt to assessment at the end of the last year and the start of this year, simply because they weren't sure how to actually administer that online, right? And so, one of the things, a core to, I would say, or the foundation to everything that we do with our schools and our students is focused on assessment at the start. And so with all of our students, we administer a normed reference growth assessment 3 times a year. And the reason we do that is because for a couple different reasons. One being that, we do have a high turnover in terms of students. So sometimes, or in some of our schools, we have upwards of 50% of the students are new to us at the start of each year. And so with that, we don't have a lot of sort of historical knowledge or understanding or data on those students. And so this is really a good starting point for us to be able to gather some of that information so that we know how to best engage students moving forward. And secondly, we do this is because, again, we certainly, like many, we have a population of at-risk students, and they are coming to us with gaps, and we want to be able to grow our students. And so although we may not see the proficiency at a grade level, they may not be, the data might tell us they may not be ready for grade level content, but we certainly can grow those students. And how we effectively administer such a large assessment to our students is we actually do it online. And so we do that through our platforms that we deliver our instruction on the same way. And we actually have moved to, we actually proctor all of those assessments at the start. And we do that because we want to make sure that we have reliable valid, meaningful results that we can take action with. And we all know, and if any of you that are here today, and I know the three of us here have children of our own, and we have experienced we've been experiencing along with them their experience of online learning. And we know that in some cases, when it's something new in terms of online, that they are not as eager to always do the right thing, right? And so it's easy to get distracted. And so, the proctoring really helps us to make sure from an expectation perspective that students understand the value and the importance of the assessment in us being sort of visible to them. And so we do proctor online. And it's been very successful. I will say that I can say that it's successful because we do have a 95% participation rate. So 95% of our 100,000 plus students have actually taken that assessment at the start of the year. So that's really our first sort of baseline. And that is really, again, are our students ready for grade level content? And if not, what are we going to do about that? And so the what are we going to do about that piece comes into the second part of our assessment planning is around a formative assessment and the importance of doing that in between the growth assessment. So it's great to assess our students 3 times a year, but what do we do in between that? How do we know that our students are learning and mastering content? And that's through our formative assessment planning. And so that is done in a couple of different ways. So as Jeanna mentioned at the start, as an organization, we actually have online curriculum courses developed specifically for the delivery of online. So our students are in their coursework, they're working through their lessons. And so from a teaching perspective, we actually have data on their lesson, their unit assessment. So we get a sense of what they're doing on grade level in their content. But then as we are asynchronously and synchronously working with our students, so in our live sessions with our students, we actually have the opportunity to sort of rethink how we assess students. So not everything in terms of formative assessment has to be a quiz or a multiple choice or something that's written. We have the opportunity actually in our live sessions to sort of poll our students and check in the moment. Are they understanding what's happening? We can ask them questions through chat. We can actually have them in breakout rooms and working collaboratively with students and assess. And so sometimes we are not just assessing for content knowledge, but we're also assessing for sort of just those learning skills, right? Are students able to manage their time? Are they able to work with other students? Are they able to offer feedback to the other students? And we're also, assessing those cognitive strategies. So again, we don't have the privilege of, and for those districts that move to online, you kind of lose a lot of that face-to-face and sort of those cues that you get from students. And as you're working with students and you see sort of that light bulb moment for them, we don't always have that same opportunity. And so through the tools within the system, and so I would say part of being effective is teachers really knowing and understanding how to use our platforms and our tools effectively to be able to engage students in assessing them. And that, again, that assessment being not just a test, but simply asking them a question and getting answers in the chat. And the great thing about that is that with all the different tools, it does provide some equity, right? It provides an opportunity for all students to participate. So for students who are in an environment now where they have a little bit of anxiety, they're not really comfortable sharing, not comfortable being on camera, they don't really want to be on the microphone, there are so many ways to actually assess that student without them having to do that and grab a microphone and say something online. And so some of the strategies that we use, and you might be familiar with these, is just sort of that waterfall, right? So we might ask a student a question. We might say, hold on to your answer. Go ahead and put it into the chat, but don't actually hit enter. We don't want to see it yet. And so when we say, go ahead, enter, they all entered in. And so they all come in and nobody knows what anyone else said, right? So no one is hesitant to be like, well, that wasn't my answer, so I'm not going to type anything in there. And so we have, again, ways within our platforms to be able to really assess our students beyond just the typical paper and pencil type of assessment. And then I would say, lastly, it's really thinking about effectively again, using the tools that we have and the supplemental tools that we have to think about assessing, again, beyond just what they're doing in the content. And so we have, again, a real focus around SEL this year. And the fact that, we are, again, trying to assess those learning skills, the cognitive piece, is a really important part of the overall piece, because we're assessing their engagement level as well, because that's giving us a lot of information in terms of how we now approach working with students moving forward. So certainly can be effective. We certainly can be present in assessing our students, even though we are not face-to-face with them in a classroom. So I'm actually going to go ahead based on that. I want to ask Niyoka, as I'm talking about sort of, assessment and how we effectively do that. The engagement piece is so important to that. And so, as I mentioned, like we certainly get some data and some information from an engagement perspective that to kind of help us as teachers make some plans on how we approach it. But how do we get teachers to really embrace online learning? So what have we been doing to really get them excited about online learning and the opportunity to engage students differently than they have in the past?
Definitely, I can definitely speak to that. I think, transitioning to online learning for anyone is a new phenomenon, right? You're like, this is something new that I have to embrace, and I have to try to figure out, how am I going to educate my students online? Well, I think one of the things that we have to do as leaders in this space is make sure that we open up a space for teachers to get comfortable with the new norm. So, you're used to being physically in that space, working with those students, and some of those skills and strategies still transition to when you're working with students online. And so I think we have to make sure that communication and that conversation is constantly open. So we're saying, like, exactly what you did with that project that you did in the building, you can still transition that same project online. You just have to think outside of the box. And so I think as a part of this process, as we're making this shift, we have to really walk alongside our teachers and really help them understand that this space is endless. So there's so much opportunity, there's so much potential for you to bring in other pieces into the classroom. You can bring in speakers that may not even live in the same city or state. And so think about how, hard that was to bring in a speaker in the classroom when you were in brick and mortar. If a person lives in Australia, now you have the internet where you can bring them in, have them on the screen, and have students interact with people within careers that they like, or maybe that they're a specialist in Shakespeare and they're coming and talking to them about Shakespeare, or they've had some type of intimate experience that is going to be good for some relevance for your students as you're working with them in the classroom. And I think we also need to make sure that as leaders in this space, as we're working with our teachers, that we build relationships with our teachers. You still have to be there. You still have to build that sense of community, have that sense of culture within your school for your teachers to understand, this is a change, but I'm right there with you. So I'm going to be here to support you. I'm going to help you get through the process. Here are some strategies that we love that we think you could use. Here's what great online instruction looks like. Here's what a bad example might look like. You have to give them some choices and some pieces to look at so they know what they're striving for. And so as you're talking about your observations and the feedback that you're giving as you're working with those teachers, you want to have that really aligned with what they know and what they need to know, and then also make sure that they know exactly what you're looking for. So also, I think during this time, we try to make sure that we show empathy. We have a lot of new teachers that come from brick and mortar that are new to online learning as well. And so we have new teacher onboarding, which is our program for our new teachers that lasts about 18 months. And they go through a very strenuous program that talks about not only just the platforms and the tools that we use, but also how to be effective in this space. And so I think that we have to understand that when you come into a new space and you're doing new things, people are going to struggle. We have to be okay with people failing and taking those as opportunities to learn more. I think, in this pandemic, when we went to the remote learning or the emergency crisis learning that we did, teachers felt like they couldn't fail. They felt like they were constantly being watched. They had to do all these different things immediately. You had to make it happen. You couldn't lose any ground. And I think that we have to take a step back and understand how change works, right? Not everybody's going to like change. Not everybody's ready for it, but you have to prep your teams for it. And so when trying to get teachers excited about it, you as a school leader have to also be excited about it. So you're bringing that fun into your team meetings, into your trainings, into your professional development, and also just modeling what that looks like as well. So one of the things that we work with our teachers on is being an edutainer. So actually entertaining your students and engaging them and getting them to come in the classroom. That might be you're creating these commercials or brain breaks is what we call them, that gives the student a moment to kind of have some downtime during an online class as they're staring at the screen all day. So we do take time to train our teachers on how to build those brain breaks. How do you make a quick commercial or a quick video that a student can engage in and you know that they're actually engaging in? And so I think those are some of the things that we actually really train and develop our teachers on. And we've been developing some district teachers as well as they've made this transition. But if we're not excited about it, the students aren't going to be excited about it. So if your teachers are going into that classroom with, kind of that I'm not really excited, I really don't know what to do, it's okay. Like, it's a learning process. And we can learn a lot from our students. I think Jeanna said it best, and they're digital natives. So they already know how to utilize social media. They already know how to use all of the functionality in this whiteboard, in this space where we are now. They can figure it out quicker than we can. So it's okay for us to get in there and learn with them, but also making sure that they understand the content and the curriculum that we're providing. But everybody needs to be okay with this new norm and also okay with being a little bit uncomfortable. And so I think one of the things that we try to push, again, is that edutainer piece, and then also showing them how to be the best at what they do in an online space. So I think that's one of the things that we have really pushed, even when we're working with district schools and working with our internal teachers. And our new teachers get to actually show those things. So they get to show and create videos. We talk to them about lighting, and we talk to them about backgrounds, and make sure they understand, like, what is a good background? What is good lighting? When you come into this space, you think you know those things, and then you're like, you did a video and you're like, oh man, it was so dark, I got to redo it. But those are the things that we really help to show them and actually walk them through those pieces, but then also give them time to actually demonstrate how that works. So I think that we just have to really be open, and as leaders, make sure that we're working with our teachers and actually rolling up our sleeves and showing them that it can be done, but make sure that you have some examples to show them that it works, and give them some data, show them those pieces across the board that you've seen from other schools or other districts, and allow them to really kind of search their way through and figure out how are they going to do this in their online classroom. And there's going to be millions of things that they want to do that they wanted to try in a brick and mortar classroom. And maybe now is the time. So as a school leader, don't close them off and box them in. Allow them to step outside of that box and really be creative and innovative in the classroom. And so, Faith, we talk about teacher effectiveness all the time. We talk about how teacher effectiveness and the teacher really drives student outcomes. What do you think that teachers anywhere across the nation need to know to increase student outcomes and student growth?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I will definitely take that question. But first, let me say, I love the idea of edutainer. I'm going to start using that more often because it's so true. And I think that's true of anyone teaching of this generation. We have to be much more entertaining than we have been in the past. I love that. And I also loved your comment around just, the empathy and sort of also being a learner. And I heard someone, another panelist in a session Monday, speak to something similar, saying that, teachers need to be learners and need to ride alongside students as well, because we have to be more empathetic of what we're asking students to do and learn in this new way is new for them. And actually, as adults, we probably hadn't experienced that ourselves as a learner. And so just being open to learning along with them. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. Yeah, so what we have done on our part is we've done a lot of research on here at K12 around sort of teacher effectiveness, specifically to the online environment, and what really are those sort of characteristics or those behaviors of our effective online teachers. Because I'm going to be honest, not everything that is done in a brick and mortar translates well into the online environment. And it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that we need to think differently about how we approach it. And so you see there on the screen, there's really sort of four sort of components or four like sort of key areas. And the first one is building relationships. And as I say this, none of this, for those of you that are here as educators, this isn't surprising, right? This is exactly what you would hope to see, right? As we agree that building relationships and having those are most important. And you probably can think back to your own time in school, and you remember those teachers, and those are the ones that you had a relationship with, who cared about you and who really actively pursued getting to know you and how you learned and what was important to you. And so teachers do that as well here at K12 in an online environment. Again, that looks a little bit differently. So all of our teachers are, every single one of them are spending time welcoming students to the school year, to their classroom. And so they are calling students and learning coaches and having those conversations that you would potentially, as a teacher, send that questionnaire home to parents and say, tell me about your student. Tell me what they like. What are they good at? What are their interests? We're doing that either online, again, in a conference style platform, or on the phone. And we're having those conversations directly with students and with learning coaches to learn more about what their students do well. And so teachers are taking that and doing really great things with that and translating that into the classroom to meet the needs of every single student. And so taking those interests and creating those into lessons and opportunities for students. And secondly is really around data-driven practices. And we focus a lot here at K12 with our teachers, and Niyoka can speak to some of that in terms of the training. We spend a lot of effort and time training our teachers on being data-driven. And we have a lot of data, but how are we actually using that data effectively and meaningfully? And so our teachers are spending time in data meetings, collaboratively working with each other and looking at the data for their individual students as a classroom, as a grade level. And then they're making decisions around instruction and how they're going to approach working with students to master those skills based on the data. And then they're coming back and they're having a second conversation. Did it actually work? Right? Did that strategy actually work? And how do we replicate that? And if it didn't work, how are we changing and making adjustments? So the data-driven piece is so important. You heard me speak to the assessment and sort of that being our initial baseline, but we're looking at the data that we have, again, from the coursework, from how our engagement, our interaction with students in our live sessions, to really make sure we're honing in specifically on what students need on that continuum, and we're really working to grow individual students. And I'll also mention part of the data-driven piece that's an important part this year as well is around, again, the SEL. So we're actually, all of our schools are delivering sort of those standalone SEL lessons. And so we're actually using the data from that as well as surveying our students to learn a little bit more about where they are emotionally and what they sort of know about themselves and what they're hoping to learn. And that's really feeding into what we're doing instructionally with our students as well. And the third piece is around sort of customizing and personalizing learning. And this is such a focus for our teachers here. And again, such an opportunity in the online environment to do just that. And so what we really focus in on sort of instructional mapping up front. And so we're really looking at what within the standards and the skills and objectives are being really covered in our courses. And you heard Jeanna again speak to all the courses that we offer to our students. And so our students are spending time asynchronously working in those courses, and they're getting the instruction, they're getting the modeling right there in their courses. And so it's important that we're not necessarily duplicating that effort. And so what's great about in this online environment is we don't have to stand and deliver every single lesson and objective in the same way that we did in a brick and mortar setting. Our students are working in the coursework, and even if you don't have the online course piece of this, I would encourage as school leaders to really think about sitting down and thinking about what do we expect students to do asynchronously on their own, offline, versus what we do synchronously with students. And the synchronous piece, the focus should be on really getting the biggest bang for your buck and utilizing and leveraging the limited time that you're going to have with students face-to-face and what you do at that time. And so thinking about asynchronous, we ask our teachers in that instructional mapping, what are they doing in the coursework and where might be some gaps? And then synchronously, how do we cover that in a more innovative way, right? So instead of kids coming into our virtual classrooms and us just standing there and delivering and them consuming content, we're asking them to use that time to actually have them working in groups, have them actually working on projects, have them come with their questions, have them come so that we can actually do some additional modeling with them and they can practice. And so the focus around the personalized piece is really important. And the other piece to this is also the targeted instruction. Our focus is around, as I mentioned, not the need to deliver everything the same way to every single student. And the targeted piece is really crucial to that. And so we really expect our teachers to be working with small groups of students. And so not having an entire classroom of 25, 30, 40 kids coming to us and us delivering something very similar to them. We're asking them to really use, again, from their data-driven practices, use the data to identify where students are excelling and how do we enrich that, and where students are struggling. And we pull those students in and we actually focus on what it is that they're missing that they need, instead of it just being a repeat of what they may have gotten in the lessons. And that targeted piece is really important in targeting specifically what they need, individual skills that they need, particularly those precursor skills to be successful for the grade level content. And then I would say the last thing we focus really around is the professional responsibilities. And this really plays into the importance, as I mentioned, of teachers understanding and being very comfortable with the tools and the resources that we have, because that is what we have to engage our students, and they need to be able to understand and leverage those. And so the training and the professional learning that is offered and the opportunities, making sure that they're engaging in those is a really important piece to that, and that they are coming with the growth mindset themselves, right? Understanding that all of our students are coming to us at different places, and we need to grow as professionals in order to grow our students. We cannot be stagnant and continue to do the same things over and over, or again, try and take what we might have done in a brick and mortar classroom and do that in an online environment. We need to be open to those and holding those accountable to the training and the professional learning and what they commit to. Our teachers who have seen the most growth with their students, so our teachers that have the highest % of their classroom growing and meeting adequate growth, are teachers who have that mindset and do whatever it takes to get students to grow, and they're trying new things and they're open to that. And so from a professional responsibility, really knowing that. And the last piece of the professional responsibility is understanding and knowing their subject matter and the standards that go along with that. It's really important, again, as we talked about the instructional mapping, to make sure that they fully understand the standards from a horizontal perspective, but also vertical. And what is it that they need, that students need to know to be successful in the next grade level. So those are really the key areas that that we actually focus in on. And so that takes me right into a question that I have for Niyoka from a talent development and community perspective. How do we actually prepare schools and teachers to transition to online learning? Like, where do we think some of the schools or districts may have went wrong when it comes to training and developing their staff, and what's missing that they should be thinking about that we've experienced?
Yeah, and we all make a few wrong turns, right? So it's what's important is that we get back on the path. So I think some of the things that I've seen, and we've worked with a lot of districts, we've done a lot of training. We've probably trained at least 30,000 people over the summer. And so that was, an interesting aspect for us to really just dive in and start training teachers and figuring out, what platforms are you using? How are you going to do this? And I think one of the things that probably was a bit of a misstep is to focus on the logistics and the mechanics of it all, right? We purchased Google Suite. Now, how do we use that? So we're training your teachers on how to use Google Suite, but we're spending so much time on how to use the platform and how to use the tools that we didn't really get to dive into. Now what? I know how to use Google Suite. I can give feedback in a document. I can do all these things, that are interactive with my students. But then now what? What are the next steps? And so I think that we have to really focus on the art and science of teaching online. And so we have these effective strategies. We've done a lot of research. Our team has worked with SNHU. We have a strong partnership with SNHU. We helped to build the first master's in teaching online, and that our entire staff has the opportunity to take part in. And so within that, though, SNHU really worked closely with us. They did focus groups. They called and talked to our teachers. They talked to our families, and they really looked at our instruction, and they came up with 61 competencies that a teacher needs to know to be effective in an online space. I know you're thinking like 61, but if you think about those 61, most of them are actually some things that teachers already know. You think about authentic learning and building relationships. These are all pieces that we're already doing in brick and mortar. But within those competencies, understanding how does that translate into an online environment. And so with those 61 competencies, we took those competencies and built out what we called professional learning modules. And so those professional learning modules will cover more, maybe 2 or 3 competencies, depending on the depth of the competency. But our teachers have the ability to go through those modules asynchronously or synchronously to get that content and master those skills. One of the things that we did with our training, though, is that we really made a transition from the one and done training. You guys know you go and you take a 60-minute training and you answer 2 questions, true or false, and you're good to go, right? But we really took a step away from that. And we really want our teachers to actually show what they know. So we have to make sure that they've mastered that particular skill, no matter what it is. If it's everybody writes, we want to see that all the students are writing on the whiteboard. That's one thing that we'll actually go into the classroom to see, to ensure that they've mastered whatever skill or strategy they're working on. And so for those of you who don't know what everybody writes is, if you have read Teach Like a Champion, it's one of those strategies that we use in the classroom for students to be able to show their work. But you don't have to wait for one student to do it. All of the students can actually write on the board and show their work. And so I think that those are some of the things that we have been trying to really focus on with anybody that we work with, no matter where they are in the process. But those 61 competencies and those modules and that training, everything goes hand in hand, and it's aligned with our walkthroughs or our observations that we do for our teachers. So we're going in and looking for those things that we're actually training and developing them on, so that they know exactly what's expected of them. So Faith, I hope that answered your question.
That does. And we actually had a question from Kristen. And I hope, Kristen, that we just answered your question. It was around, what should teacher prep programs be doing to better prepare teachers for this type of instruction? So I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Niyoka, that maybe we missed, but I think you mentioned really around not just the practicality or operational piece of how to use the tools, but how they leverage that in terms of the instruction, and also sort of being a little bit more open to failure and trying different things. But are there anything else you wanted to add to better answer that question?
So we have worked with a lot of teacher prep programs. And so I think one of the things that we have helped with, where we found some gaps, is trying to actually show what it looks like. I think, we can talk high level, we can talk about the pedagogy, we can talk about all the, historical elements of what is teaching and teaching online. But if you don't see it, you don't necessarily understand it. So like, for example, as I'm talking about everybody writes, you guys may not totally get it until you actually see it. And so I think showing those skills in those teacher prep programs and really working and partnering with online programs to be able to have those as a resource, I think will be great. And so if there's any teacher programs that are looking for some support, we are here to help.
That's perfect. And I think even in our environment, Niyoka, with the 6,000 teachers or so that we have, even though they've all been trained, some of them have, as Jeanna mentioned, 5-10 years of experience, we still get asked all the time of like, how do you do that? How does that look here? Can I see an example of that? Or can I see how someone else is doing that? So we get that all the time, even in our environment where we have the experienced teachers. So it's such an important piece for those that have really limited experience in doing this online, to have those sort of examples will be really helpful for seeing that. And then Jeanna, I think this is a question that you hopefully can answer for us. But Jessica asked a question about, from state lawmaker perspective, what can they do on the policy front to get the conditions right for effective online teaching and ensure that those expectations aren't being lowered?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks, Jess, for asking that. I've been kind of contemplating as I saw you put that in there a little while ago. I think first and foremost, from the state lawmaker position, is to help with those conditions is bring those groups together. You need to bring together your key superintendents and stakeholders across the state and help develop a framework for what online education look like, what those minimums in the state would be, what the expectation would be. We saw several states took that stance as they prepared for this year. And I would say it made their schools and districts in that state better for it. They provided a framework that said, you have to have a plan for online learning and what it means for all students and how you will meet those needs. And they outlined what that framework is. And we don't want to swing the pendulum too far to get too over prescriptive. But at the same time, being that this is so new, I watched individual superintendents, individual building principals trying to reinvent the wheel on their own, where there is power in leveraging state level resources, bringing together advisory panels and things at the state level to help bring those resources together, share those resources, and more quickly build capacity. But lacking a framework, the state where I reside, it frankly was a free-for-all. You want to do online education, you want the schools open, you want the schools closed. There were no minimum expectations. And as a parent sitting here with one child in a charter and one child in a public school district, I have had two vastly different experiences in what it's meant personally for me. So I think at the state lawmaker level, the way in which we bring those advisory panels together, you bring those resources together at a state level for those, especially smaller districts that don't know where to begin, there's strength in that power in bringing those committees together and providing that framework. And it should have minimums, so you can ensure that those expectations are not lowered. And even things that like Niyoka talked about of teacher observation and evaluation, schools and states and districts should be prepared for what that looks like now. We shouldn't throw out teacher observation and evaluation simply because they're now online. What are the minimum expectations for that? And build those frameworks and standards, for it.
Perfect. Yeah, it's a great answer. So I know we're really approaching the end of our time together. So Niyoka, any parting thoughts that you wanted to share?
No, I really wanted to talk through just really quickly, like what I think that teachers should know. Like you guys want to take away just 3 quick takeaways. They need to know when they're working with diverse learners, they need to know what to teach. Follow the data. The data will tell you everything that you need to know when you're working with your students, but then also having those conversations and when you're building those relationships will give you even more data as you're working with those students to understand what they need to know. And then teachers, of course, need to know how to teach. And so that means making sure that they know how to be effective in this space. They have strategies and skills that they can pull out of their back pocket to use at any point in time. And then we call it making it sticky. So once you go through that professional development or you go through that training, then what? They have to transfer that into the actual classroom. And you as leaders need to make sure that you're there to actually see it and give them feedback and support them in their efforts, because this is a new effort. It's a huge feat for them to try something new in front of a group of students, and everybody's nervous about this new online environment. So be there for them, support them, and make sure that they have everything they need. If you need to go get it from someone else, go get it, because your teachers need it and your students need it. And so, Faith, I just wanted to leave those 3 tidbits as takeaways for today.
Those are perfect. Those are great takeaways. Totally agree. And I would say, before I ask Jeanna her final thoughts, I would say something similar around, when we're thinking about, effective online, the couple pieces that I would say are super important. Again, just to reiterate, the assessment piece is really crucial, if not more so in the online environment, because we really don't have those cues that we would have in a classroom, and we really need to have the data to be able to better understand where our students are coming from and where they need to go. And the second piece I would say would be a second takeaway is to really spend time thinking about what is delivered asynchronously versus synchronously, leveraging the time that you actually have face-to-face live with students and how they interact with each other, right? That's such an important piece to this as well, being effective. They need to be able to still be interacting with their peers and providing peer-to-peer feedback. And so how do you leverage the time to do that then versus things that they can do on their own in terms of reading or watching a video and coming prepared with their questions to the live session. So Jeanna, with that, do you have any final thoughts for our participants today as they think about effective online learning?
Yeah, well, thank you first and foremost for you all joining us in this conversation. And there's one key part of this conversation we didn't focus on. Today we focused very much on kind of the school leaders and the teachers. But please don't take that to mean that it isn't critically important that the parents have a seat at the table in this. In this preparation, far too often, parents were left out of this equation, or the thoughts of how parents would make this work in the home learning environment. And the National Parents Union released an outcomes of a survey this week that I want to leave you with. 59% of parents say they would prefer schools to focus on improving online and remote learning. and 58% of them want schools to continue to provide online options for students after the pandemic. So 58% of the parents want this option to continue and are charging their schools with figuring out how to make this innovative model work. So while we talked a lot about here, talking about the school leaders and teachers and what they need to do, I think another key takeaway in kind of the next phase of a conversation like this is bringing parents to the table and understanding what they need, what they see their students need to also make an online blended or hybrid model work. So you can never underestimate the power of having parents at that table and a part of the planning and solutioning. So thank you so much for your time today, and my colleagues, Faith and Niyoka, for joining us today. We hope we've given you some food for thought, and so appreciate all of your commitment and participation in this week's summit. And we are always here if anyone would like to connect further. Our information is available, and we are always here and willing to connect with anyone. So thank you for your time today.